Tonight, a major court development in a case that began as a missing child search and has now entered the criminal justice system. Ashlee Buzzard has appeared before a judge and pleaded not guilty in connection with the death of her 9-year-old daughter, Melodee Buzzard. Prosecutors are pursuing the most serious charges available, raising questions about evidence, potential sentencing, and what happens next as the case moves forward. The case reached a critical moment as Ashlee Buzzard appeared in court for her first arraignment. This marked the official start of formal criminal proceedings following weeks of investigation into the disappearance and death of her 9-year-old daughter, Melodee Buzzard. The hearing drew attention not only because of the charges, but because of how the case first emerged as a missing child report. During the arraignment, Buzzard entered a plea of not guilty. According to reporters inside the courtroom, the moment carried visible tension, particularly among family members seated behind the prosecution. Court officials briefly intervened to maintain order, highlighting how emotionally charged the hearing had become, despite its formal legal setting. The judge ordered that Ashlee Buzzard remain in custody without bail. Prosecutors argued that the seriousness of the charges and the potential sentence justified continued detention. The court agreed, noting that this decision was procedural and not a judgment on guilt or innocence at this stage. A preliminary hearing was scheduled as the next step in the case. At that hearing, prosecutors must present enough evidence to show that the case should proceed toward trial. Legal experts note this is a lower standard than a trial verdict, but it plays a major role in shaping how the case moves forward. Prosecutors have charged Buzzard with first-degree murder, along with firearm-related allegations. Court filings also include a special circumstance known as lying in wait, a legal term that suggests alleged planning rather than a spontaneous act. This classification significantly increases the potential sentence if the charge is upheld. The district attorney's office has confirmed that the death penalty will not be pursued. However, prosecutors have stated that if the special circumstance is proven, the maximum sentence would be life in prison without the possibility of parole. If not, the sentence could still range from decades to life. Following the arraignment, the court imposed a gag order. This order restricts law enforcement and attorneys from releasing additional details publicly. Judges often issue such orders in high-profile cases to reduce pretrial publicity and protect the integrity of future proceedings. Before the gag order took effect, investigators from the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office had outlined the general scope of their investigation. Officials said the case began in early October as a missing child report after Melodee failed to return home from a road trip. Authorities stated that Ashlee Buzzard returned home alone after the trip. Melodee did not. At that time, investigators focused on locating the child, reviewing travel routes, and identifying possible sightings. The case was initially treated as a search effort rather than a criminal investigation. As days passed without confirmed sightings, the investigation expanded. Multiple agencies became involved, and the search extended across state lines. Officials emphasized that the lack of clear information early on made the timeline a central focus of their work. In early December, investigators confirmed that remains found in a remote area of Wayne County, Utah, belonged to Melodee Buzzard. The confirmation marked a major turning point, shifting the case from a search to a criminal prosecution. Law enforcement later stated they believe Melodee died shortly after she was last seen alive near the Colorado-Utah border. This conclusion, officials said, was based on evidence gathered during the investigation, though many details are now restricted by court order. Investigators reported recovering physical evidence near the location where Melodee was found. According to authorities, these items became part of a broader forensic review aimed at linking locations, timelines, and movements associated with the road trip. Officials also examined a rental vehicle used during the trip. Law enforcement stated that items recovered from the vehicle were consistent with evidence collected elsewhere, reinforcing the prosecution's theory of how the events unfolded. Search warrants were later executed at locations connected to Buzzard, including her residence. Images obtained after the scene was secured showed a disordered interior, though officials have not publicly detailed the relevance of specific findings. Throughout the investigation, authorities have stated that a specific motive has not been publicly identified. Prosecutors have emphasized that while motive can provide context, it is not legally required if other evidence supports the charges. During the arraignment, observers noted the contrast between the structured legal process and the emotional presence of Melodee's family. For them, a not guilty plea marked a painful step in a process that may take months or longer to resolve. Legal analysts say cases involving special circumstances often involve extensive pretrial litigation. Motions, evidence challenges, and procedural hearings can significantly delay the start of a trial, even after charges are formally filed. For now, the court has emphasized restraint and adherence to procedure. Judges have made clear that public discussion should not replace evidence presented under oath and subject to cross-examination. Part 1 establishes the legal foundation of the case, the charges, the court's early rulings, and the transition from investigation to prosecution. In the next part, attention will shift more closely to the road trip timeline and how investigators reconstructed Melodee Buzzard's final movements. Investigators say the foundation of this case is a road trip taken in early October. Ashlee Buzzard and her 9-year-old daughter, Melodee Buzzard, left California together, traveling across multiple states. Authorities later described this journey as central to understanding when and where Melodee was last seen alive. According to law enforcement, the pair traveled through several locations before reaching areas near the Colorado-Utah border. Investigators say this region represents the last confirmed location where Melodee was seen with her mother. From that point forward, no verified sightings of the child were documented. Officials believe the final confirmed sighting occurred around October 9th. After that date, investigators were unable to establish Melodee's movements through witnesses, surveillance footage, or financial records. This absence of information quickly raised concern and intensified the search effort. Days later, Ashlee Buzzard returned home to California without her daughter. Melodee was soon reported missing. At that stage, authorities treated the situation as a missing child investigation, focusing on locating Melodee rather than building a criminal case. Early efforts centered on retracing the road trip. Investigators reviewed travel routes, hotel stays, and known stops along the way. Officials said this process required coordination between agencies in multiple states due to the length and complexity of the trip. As time passed without confirmed leads, the scope of the investigation expanded. Federal authorities joined the effort, and the search area widened. Investigators emphasized that multi-state cases often take longer due to jurisdictional coordination and evidence review requirements. Law enforcement also examined rental records tied to a vehicle used during the trip. According to officials, this vehicle became a key element in reconstructing timelines, distances traveled, and potential stopping points along the route. Investigators stated that Ashlee Buzzard did not cooperate with the investigation during its early stages. Authorities noted this as a factor that complicated efforts to quickly determine Melodee's whereabouts, though they emphasized that cooperation levels alone do not determine guilt. The case took a decisive turn in early December when remains were located in a remote area of Wayne County, Utah. Officials described the location as difficult to access and far from populated areas, requiring a coordinated response to recover and identify the remains. Forensic testing later confirmed that the remains belonged to Melodee Buzzard. Authorities publicly announced the identification, marking the end of the search phase and the beginning of a criminal investigation tied directly to her death. Following the identification, investigators stated They believed Melodee likely died shortly after she was last seen in October. This conclusion was based on evidence reviewed during the investigation, though specific forensic details have not been fully disclosed. According to the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office, physical evidence recovered near where Melodee was found became a major focus. Officials said items collected at the scene were later analyzed and compared with other findings. Investigators reported that cartridge cases recovered in Utah were compared with ammunition connected to the road trip. Authorities said similar rounds were found inside the rental vehicle used by Ashlee Buzzard, strengthening the link between the trip and the location where Melodee was discovered. Law enforcement emphasized that the comparison process followed standard forensic procedures. Officials described this evidence as one of several factors that shifted the investigation toward criminal charges after weeks of analysis. Search warrants were later executed at locations connected to Buzzard, including her residence. Images obtained after the scene was secured showed a disordered interior, though investigators have not publicly detailed how specific findings relate to the charges. Authorities have repeatedly stated that a clear motive has not been publicly identified. Prosecutors note that while motive can help explain events, it is not required to file charges when physical evidence and timelines support the allegations. The arrest of Ashlee Buzzard came after investigators completed what they described as a comprehensive review of evidence from multiple states. Officials said the decision was made only after verifying information gathered over nearly 2 months. Following the arrest, investigators held a news conference outlining the general scope of their findings. Shortly afterward, a gag order was imposed, limiting further public discussion of evidence as the case entered the court system. Legal experts say the timeline will remain central as the case moves forward. Prosecutors must clearly connect dates, locations, and physical evidence to support their version of events, while the defense may challenge those connections. Part 2 focuses on how investigators reconstructed the road trip, expanded the search across state lines, and identified evidence that led to criminal charges. In the next part, attention will turn to courtroom strategy and what each side must prove under the law. With the arraignment complete, the case now moves deeper into the legal process. Ashlee Buzzard has formally entered a not guilty plea, which places the burden entirely on prosecutors to prove their case. From this point forward, every allegation must be supported by admissible evidence and evaluated under strict legal standards inside the courtroom. The next major step is the preliminary hearing. This hearing is not designed to determine guilt or innocence. Instead, prosecutors must show there is sufficient cause to believe a crime occurred and that the defendant is connected to it. If the judge agrees, the case will proceed toward trial. If not, charges may be reduced or dismissed. Prosecutors have filed first-degree murder charges, which represent the most serious classification under California law. In addition to that charge, they have alleged firearm-related enhancements and a special circumstance known as lying in wait, a legal term that suggests alleged planning rather than an impulsive action. The inclusion of a special circumstance significantly raises the potential sentence. Prosecutors have confirmed that they will not seek the death penalty. However, if the special circumstance is proven in court, the maximum sentence would be life in prison without the possibility of parole. Without it, the sentence could still range from 25 years to life. To support these charges, prosecutors are expected to rely on a combination of physical evidence, reconstructed timelines, and expert testimony. Investigators have already referenced forensic comparisons, travel records, and location-based analysis gathered across multiple states during the investigation. One of the central challenges for prosecutors will be clearly presenting how evidence connects locations, dates, and movements during the road trip. The case depends heavily on establishing when and where key events occurred, rather than relying on witness testimony alone. Legal analysts note that cases built largely on physical and forensic evidence often involve detailed expert explanations. Prosecutors must ensure that jurors understand how evidence was collected, tested, and linked, without overwhelming them with technical detail. The defense, meanwhile, is expected to carefully examine how investigators reach their conclusions. Defense attorneys may question whether evidence was properly handled, whether timelines are precise, and whether alternative interpretations of the same information are possible. At this stage, the defense has not publicly outlined its strategy. This is common early in high-profile cases, especially when a gag order limits public statements. Any challenges to the prosecution's case are likely to emerge during formal court hearings rather than through the media. The court's decision to impose a gag order reflects the sensitivity of the case. Judges often use such orders to limit public discussion that could influence potential jurors or compromise the fairness of future proceedings. Because of these restrictions, much of what happens next may appear quiet to the public. Legal filings, evidence review, and pretrial motions often occur without public hearings, even though they play a critical role in shaping the eventual trial. Another issue likely to be examined is cooperation during the investigation. Authorities have stated that Buzzard did not initially assist investigators. While this detail may be referenced by prosecutors, legal experts caution that limited cooperation alone cannot be used as proof of guilt. The prosecution's timeline will remain central to the case. Investigators believe that Melodee Buzzard died shortly after she was last seen in October. Establishing this time frame is essential to supporting the charges as filed. Because the case spans multiple states, prosecutors must also demonstrate that evidence was lawfully obtained and properly handled across jurisdictions. Any procedural errors could become focal points for the defense during pretrial motions. Legal experts say preliminary hearings often preview the strengths and weaknesses of each side's case. While the standard of proof is lower than at trial, judges still scrutinize whether the prosecution's theory is supported by credible evidence. If the case advances beyond the preliminary hearing, both sides will begin preparing for a possible trial. That process can take months and involves witness preparation, expert review, and extensive legal argument. During this period, public updates may remain limited. Courts often prioritize orderly proceedings over frequent disclosures, particularly in cases that have drawn national attention. Despite the slow pace, each legal step serves a purpose. Motions, rulings, and hearings are designed to ensure that when evidence is presented, it meets constitutional and procedural requirements. For families involved, the legal process can feel distant and formal. For the court, however, maintaining structure and neutrality is essential to ensuring that outcomes are based on evidence rather than emotion. Part 3 focuses on the legal framework now guiding this case, from charging decisions to evidentiary standards. In the next part, attention will shift to public response, media coverage, and how high-profile cases involving children are handled beyond the courtroom. As the case entered the courtroom, public attention intensified rapidly. The arraignment of Ashlee Buzzard became national news within hours, reflecting how cases involving missing children often resonate far beyond the local communities where they begin. News outlets focused closely on the legal facts presented, emphasizing the seriousness of the charges and the court's early rulings. Much of the coverage highlighted the not guilty plea, the denial of bail, and the potential sentence if the charges are upheld. Media reports consistently noted that these are allegations, not conclusions, reinforcing the principle that the legal process must play out in court before any final determination is made. Inside the courtroom, the presence of family members underscored the emotional weight of the proceedings. Observers described visible reactions from relatives as the plea was entered. These moments, while brief, illustrated the human impact behind the formal language used in legal filings and court hearings. For Melodee Buzzard's family, the arraignment represented a painful transition. What began months earlier as a search filled with uncertainty has now become a prolonged legal process. Family members now face a series of hearings rather than search updates, a shift that many families in similar cases describe as deeply difficult. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case acknowledged the high level of public interest. Officials stated that while attention can help keep a case visible, it also increases the responsibility to communicate carefully and accurately, particularly when a case involves a child and unresolved legal questions. That responsibility was reflected in the court's decision to impose a gag order. By limiting public statements from investigators and attorneys, the judge aimed to reduce speculation and ensure that future jurors are not influenced by information presented outside the courtroom. Legal analysts note that gag orders are common in high-profile cases, especially when national media coverage is intense. The goal is not secrecy, but fairness, ensuring that evidence is evaluated based on testimony and exhibits presented under oath, rather than commentary or repeated headlines. Before the gag order took effect, authorities had already shared key elements of the investigation, including the general timeline and the discovery of Melodee's remains. Since then, updates have focused primarily on procedural developments rather than new investigative details. This shift reflects a broader transition from investigation to prosecution. Once charges are filed, courts become the primary forum for resolving disputes about evidence. Public briefings often give way to motions, hearings, and legal arguments that occur largely outside public view. Media outlets covering the case have emphasized this distinction. Reports often reiterate that court filings represent one side's allegations and that defense arguments will be heard through the legal process, not press statements or interviews. Public reaction has also included wider discussions about missing child cases and how quickly circumstances can change. Advocates point out that early attention is crucial, but they also stress the importance of responsible reporting once a case enters the court system. Legal experts caution viewers and readers against drawing conclusions too early. A not guilty plea signals that the case will be tested through evidence and cross-examination, not decided by public sentiment or emotional response. National media coverage has largely avoided speculation about motive, noting that prosecutors themselves have not publicly identified one. This restraint aligns with court guidance and helps keep attention focused on verified facts rather than assumptions. Journalists have also highlighted the complexity of cases that span multiple states. Coordinating evidence, witnesses, and legal procedures across jurisdictions can significantly lengthen the timeline even after an arrest has been made. Within the local community, the case has left a lasting impact. Vigils, memorial messages, and quiet acts of remembrance reflect how deeply the disappearance and death of a child can affect people far beyond the immediate family. Officials involved in the investigation have described the case as one that required sustained coordination and careful review. They emphasized that decisions were made only after evidence from multiple sources had been analyzed and confirmed. For viewers following the case, the coming weeks may seem uneventful. Much of what happens next will take place through legal filings and hearings rather than dramatic public announcements. Still, each procedural step represents progress within the justice system. Preliminary hearings, motions, and rulings all shape how evidence will eventually be presented and evaluated if the case goes to trial. Courts have made clear that their priority is ensuring a fair and orderly process. Managing public attention is part of that effort, particularly in cases involving children and intense emotional response. Part 4 places the case within its broader public and media context, showing how legal proceedings unfold under national scrutiny. In the final part, attention will turn to what lies ahead and how the court process may ultimately reach a conclusion. As the case enters its next phase, attention now shifts to upcoming court proceedings and what they will determine. Ashlee Buzzard remains in custody as the judicial process moves forward. From this point, decisions will be guided by procedural rules, evidentiary standards, and judicial review rather than investigative announcements or public briefings. The preliminary hearing represents the most immediate milestone. At that hearing, prosecutors must demonstrate that sufficient evidence exists for the case to proceed toward trial. This stage does not decide guilt, but it determines whether the charges are legally supported enough to move forward within the court system. If the judge finds probable cause, the case will advance to further pretrial proceedings. These may include motions challenging evidence, legal arguments about admissibility, and scheduling decisions. Each step plays a role in shaping what a potential trial would ultimately look like. If the judge does not find sufficient cause, prosecutors could be required to modify or reduce charges. Legal analysts note that while dismissals at this stage are uncommon, the preliminary hearing can significantly narrow the scope of a case. For prosecutors, the challenge lies in clearly presenting a case built largely on timelines, forensic findings, and physical evidence. Their filings indicate an effort to show deliberate actions over time rather than isolated or accidental events. The defense, meanwhile, will have the opportunity to question how that evidence was gathered and interpreted. Defense attorneys may examine whether investigative conclusions are supported by verifiable facts and whether alternative explanations remain possible under the law. Throughout this phase, the presumption of innocence remains central. The not guilty plea entered earlier ensures that all allegations must be proven in court, not assumed based on public reaction or the severity of the charges filed. A court-imposed gag order continues to limit what information can be shared publicly. As a result, many developments may occur without immediate public updates, with details emerging primarily through court hearings and official filings. Legal experts say this quieter period is common in complex cases. Much of the work happens behind the scenes as attorneys prepare arguments, review evidence, and consult experts in advance of formal proceedings. At the center of the case remains Melodee Buzzard, a 9-year-old whose disappearance prompted a multi-state search. Her case moved from uncertainty to confirmation, and now to a prolonged legal process focused on accountability. What began as a missing child investigation has evolved into a serious criminal prosecution. Authorities have emphasized that their role now is to present evidence, while the court's role is to determine how that evidence is weighed under the law. Cases involving children often carry heightened public interest, but courts stress the need for restraint. Legal outcomes are determined through procedure and proof, not emotion or public expectation, regardless of how compelling the circumstances may be. As the case continues, timelines may stretch over months or longer. Pretrial motions, hearings, and scheduling issues often take time, particularly in cases involving multiple jurisdictions and extensive evidence review. During this period, updates may be limited to brief court appearances or written rulings. While this can feel slow to observers, legal experts note that careful review is essential to ensuring a fair process for all parties involved. Public attention may fluctuate, but the court process remains steady. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys are bound by legal standards designed to produce outcomes based on evidence, rather than pressure or publicity. If the case ultimately proceeds to trial, jurors would be asked to consider evidence presented in court and evaluate it according to the law. Until then, no final conclusions can be drawn. For the families involved, the legal process can be emotionally challenging. Court proceedings often feel impersonal, yet they represent the structured path through which accountability is examined. Observers note that the outcome of the preliminary hearing will shape the direction of the case. It will determine whether prosecutors continue toward trial or adjust their approach based on judicial findings. As of now, the case remains active and unresolved. Ashlee Buzzard stays in custody, and both sides prepare for the next phase within the court system. Part 5 concludes the current overview of this case. What lies ahead will unfold through hearings, rulings, and legal argument, with final determinations made inside the courtroom, guided by evidence, procedure, and the principles of justice. One of the most closely watched aspects of this case is the potential sentence. Prosecutors have made clear that while they will not seek the death penalty, they are pursuing the most severe punishment available under California law if Ashlee Buzzard is convicted. That possibility has placed renewed attention on how sentencing works in cases involving special circumstances. At the center of this discussion is the charge of first-degree murder combined with the special circumstance known as lying in wait. Under California law, this designation suggests alleged planning and deliberate action rather than an impulsive event. When prosecutors include this allegation, it significantly changes the sentencing landscape. Default if the special circumstance is upheld in court, the maximum sentence becomes life in prison without the possibility of parole. This means that, if convicted under that finding, the defendant would never be eligible for release. Prosecutors have stated this outcome reflects the seriousness of the allegations as they are currently charged. Ext. If the special circumstance is not proven, the sentence would still be severe. First-degree murder without that enhancement typically carries a sentence of 25 years to life. In practical terms, that still means decades in custody before any parole consideration, depending on how the court ultimately rules. Legal experts note that prosecutors do not file special circumstances lightly. Doing so requires confidence that evidence can support claims of planning and intent. In this case, authorities have pointed to timelines, travel patterns, and physical evidence as the basis for pursuing the harsher charge. Court filings suggest prosecutors believe the sequence of events surrounding the road trip is critical. Establishing when and where key actions occurred is essential to arguing that the alleged conduct involved preparation rather than a spontaneous decision. Another factor prosecutors may rely on is behavior after the trip concluded. Authorities have stated that Melodee did not return home and that investigators encountered limited cooperation during the early stages of the search. While this alone does not prove guilt, prosecutors may argue it supports their broader timeline. Defense attorneys are expected to challenge these interpretations. In cases involving potential life sentences, the defense often focuses on whether evidence truly demonstrates planning or whether alternative explanations remain plausible under the law. Sentencing discussions also highlight why prosecutors emphasize procedure and precision. Any error in how evidence is presented or how charges are framed can have major consequences when the potential outcome involves life without parole. At the heart of these legal arguments remains Melodee Buzzard, a 9-year-old whose disappearance led to a multi-state investigation. Prosecutors have repeatedly stated that their focus is on accountability through the court system, not public reaction. Courts treat cases involving children with particular care, especially when sentencing options are irreversible. Judges must ensure that findings supporting special circumstances meet the highest legal standards before allowing such penalties to stand. Legal analysts note that life without parole is one of the most serious sentences available in the United States. Because it permanently removes the possibility of release, courts scrutinize the evidence supporting such outcomes very closely. This scrutiny begins well before any trial. During pre-trial hearings, judges may evaluate whether the prosecution's theory supports the special circumstance allegation as charged. Defense motions may seek to remove or limit those allegations early in the process. If the case proceeds to trial, jurors would ultimately decide whether the special circumstance is proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That decision would directly determine whether sentencing includes the possibility of parole or not. Public discussion of sentencing often focuses on numbers and terms, but legal experts emphasize that outcomes depend entirely on evidence presented in court. Headlines do not decide sentences. Jurors and judges do. Because of this, courts discourage speculation about punishment before a verdict is reached. Even in high-profile cases, sentencing remains hypothetical until all legal standards are met. For families involved, the potential sentence represents both a legal and emotional dimension of the case. While the court focuses on law and evidence, the impact of these decisions extends far beyond the courtroom. As the case moves forward, sentencing discussions will likely resurface at each major milestone. However, courts will continue to emphasize that no outcome is determined until the legal process is complete. For now, prosecutors and defense attorneys are preparing for the next hearings, knowing that how the charges are argued today will shape the possible outcomes tomorrow. Part 6 explains why prosecutors are pursuing the harshest charges available and what those charges could mean under the law. In the final sections, attention will turn to broader lessons from the case and why accurate reporting in child cases remains essential. As this report concludes, the case now rests fully within the judicial system. Court hearings, legal motions, and evidence review will determine what happens next. At the center of the process remains Melodee Buzzard, a 9-year-old whose disappearance prompted a multi-state search and whose story continues through formal legal proceedings. Any final outcome will be decided in court based on evidence and the rule of law. Cases involving children demand careful, responsible coverage. They require accuracy, restraint, and respect for due process. While public interest remains high, courts emphasize that allegations must be tested through legal standards, not public opinion. This case reflects how missing child investigations can evolve into complex prosecutions, where timelines, evidence, and legal definitions carry lasting consequences. If you follow true child cases, including missing children investigations, court proceedings, and verified legal analysis, consider subscribing to this channel. Our goal is to document these cases responsibly, focusing on confirmed facts, courtroom developments, and the legal process, not speculation or sensationalism. Thank you for watching and staying informed. New updates will be shared as confirmed information becomes available through court records and reliable reporting. Until then, we encourage viewers to rely on verified sources, respect those affected, and remember that every case represents a child whose story deserves care, accuracy, and accountability.